Oh, all right. So I'm going to tell my story first, and so I'll get myself in a good position here. My story is called A Point of Historical Interception. During this past time, during this pandemic, I, like many other people, took my thoughts to the past. I was aided in this by my cousin in England, who's an amateur genealogist. He helped me to discover things about my family that I never knew. My parents emigrated to Canada in the 1950s from the north of England, from a place that was famous for its cotton mills, for pollution, for the Industrial Revolution. And they came here. They didn't talk too much about our family, and I'd only met a few family members a handful of times. So once I got onto the ancestry page and my cousin started showing me the roots and branches and twigs of my family, it was quite interesting. Because we're working class, people either worked at the mills or they worked in businesses that supported mill workers. So there wasn't anything too exciting, except for I have a great uncle, Sterling Marin, who was a well-known politician. During his time as councillor, alderman, and mayor, his famous thing that he did was that he worked on getting people with mental illness taken care of by the National Health Service instead of under the Poor Law. Well, I asked my cousin, what's the Poor Law? And that little simple question became a long, long email with lots and lots of data. I'll summarize it for you in a nutshell. In Great Britain, in medieval times, the poor were taken care of by the monasteries, by the nuns and the monks in the monasteries, until 1536, when King Henry VIII had a falling out with the Catholic Church and demolished all the monasteries. It wasn't until 1601, when his daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, was on the throne, that they realized they had a problem. No one was taking care of the poor. So they passed the Poor Law. This was a way of distributing aid at a parish level. And it worked quite well for 200 years, until the Industrial Revolution, when lots of people moved into the cities. So that giving aid at a parish level no longer worked. So the government decided to pass a new law. It was called the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834. And this sought to take care of the poor while saving money. They were going to spend less money at it. The way they were going to do this was to have poorhouses. Poorhouses already existed, or workhouses, but they decided to ramp those up even more. Well, at this point in the story, I'm going to fly over the Atlantic Ocean and to where I live now in Simcoe County. I had not only been looking at the history of my family, but I'd also been working with members of Storytelling Orillia to learn the history of this area where I live. Around the same time as the Poor Law Amendment Act was passed, here in Simcoe County, settlers were arriving. Before that, the Anishinaabe had lived here for thousands of years, or time immemorial. But more and more settlers were coming in, and they were getting squeezed off their land. In 1830, the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada at the time, John Colborne, he decided to try an experiment. He got the Anishinaabe of what we now call Simcoe County to move on to what he called a reserve. And this was to be the first reserve of its kind in Canada. Here we are at ground zero. The Anishinaabe were traditionally hunters, fishers, they hunted, fished, trapped, and they grew some crops, but they moved around through the territory at different times of the year. So Colborne convinced them to come and live on a reserve, which moved from the Narrows, which is now Orillia, all the way to Coldwater, with a piece of land on Matchedash Bay and a strip of land at Wabashin and a little piece in Port Severn. So they moved on to this land, and they were trying to make the best of what was happening. They were represented by 3 chiefs. In Anishinaabemowin, that's Ogumawag. So there was Ogama Meskwaki, or William Yellowhead, whose people moved into the Orillia area. There was Ogama William Snake, Joseph Snake, And there was Gimaadaadiziwin, who his people moved into the cold water area. Asans means little clamshell. So the people cleared the land. They cleared hundreds of acres. They began to grow crops. They built houses. There were schools that were run by the Methodist missionaries. They built a grist mill in Coldwater, which is still there to this day, and a sawmill in Port Severn. Meskwaki had a frame house in where we now call Orillia. And they were doing quite well at farming. In fact, they were doing so well that the local settlers petitioned the government to get the government to make it illegal for them to sell their produce, cut off this economic possibility for them. They also had a very thriving stagecoach operation, which came from this area all the way to York. And that was doing really well until the government made a law that made it illegal for Indians to ride on stagecoaches. So that meant their operators couldn't do it either. And they had to sell that business to a family in Midland, which eventually became a bus line. In 1836, the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada was replaced by Sir Francis Bondhead. Just before coming to Canada, Sir Francis Bondhead had an interesting occupation. He was made the Assistant Poor Law Commissioner for the County of Kent in England in 1834, when, as you remember, the Poor Law Amendment Act was passed. In this position, he created a document called a plan for a rural workhouse for 500 people. In this plan, men and women were separated, but the ill and the well were put together, the young and the old were put together, and the sane and the insane were put together. And the food was so poor that people could just barely survive. The idea behind this was that only the truly destitute would actually ask for help. So just after finishing this, Bondhead, and Jan will tell you a lot more about Sir Francis Bondhead coming up, but Bondhead came to Canada, or Upper Canada. He came with the belief that inequity was not only inevitable, but that it was sanctioned by God. Soon after he got here, he realized that there was all these settlers coming in, and he wanted to put them on the land that had been promised to the Anishinaabe forever. They were promised that nobody would settle on that land that was theirs forever. But he decided that the settlers should go there. And so through subterfuge, he tricked the three Ogumawag into signing a document that relinquished that land. That is not what the people wanted, but that's what happened. And this was the point, for me personally, of a historical intersection. When we think of the workhouses, we think of Oliver Twist. In fact, Charles Dickens wrote Oliver Twist in 1838, just 4 years after the Poor Law Amendment Act was enacted. And we think of that as abhorrent, please, sir, can I have more? We all can see that. And here was that very attitude that my ancestors held that had been brought here, where I live now, and used to take people whose land had been there, people who'd been taking care of the land for thousands of years off of that land. The weight of my ancestry fell heavy on my shoulders, and it was Dickens dark. So the Anishinaabe people didn't just move off the land right away. The three Ogumawag petitioned the government over and over again. Jeff Meneg of Beausoleil First Nation, a knowledge keeper, says that in oral history, it is told that Gimaadaadiziwin was a great orator. And in 1836, he called the other two Ogumawag to Coldwater along with representatives of the British Crown. It is told in oral history that he said his people wanted to govern themselves as they always had, and they wanted to be free of encroachment and oppression that threatened to extinguish their place on the land. The British didn't listen. The chiefs petitioned again and again, and when all other resources had ended, Asans and warriors did a sit-in at the grist mill in Coldwater. British Crown brought the soldiers in and they were removed. Gimaadaadiziwin was right to expect better treatment. After all, he and his warriors had fought with the British in 1812. After all, the previous year, he and his warriors had helped the British quell the Upper Canada Rebellion. But the British didn't listen and the people were moved off. Gimaadaadiziwin and his people moved to Rama. Joseph Snake and his people moved to Snake Island and Georgina Island. And Gimaadaadiziwin and his people were moved to Beausoleil Island, where they lived for 14 years under terrible conditions and eventually were allowed to relocate to Christian Island, where Beausoleil First Nation now is. But that didn't stop there. They kept petitioning. They petitioned in 1842 and in 1850, but the British didn't listen. A descendant of theirs petitioned in 1892 to the new Canadian government. They didn't listen. In 1991, now with legal representation, the Tri-Council Chippewa, which represented those three groups of people, petitioned the Canadian government to hear their land claim. The Canadian government refused. It wasn't until 2002 that the Canadian government agreed to hear the claim. And by 2012, in an out-of-court settlement, the Canadian government settled the claim for $307 million. It took 176 years to get that claim settled, but they didn't get the land. My great uncle Sterling fought for the rights of the mentally ill. It started in 1948 when the National Health Service Act was passed in Britain. And by 1959, the battle was won with the Mental Health Act being passed. It only took 11 years. He died 3 years later at the age of 61. I'll never know what motivated him to do that, but I do know that I'm inspired by what he did. And I'm inspired by my Indigenous friends and neighbors and their persistence and their way of creating new pathways for all of us together. And so I want to live out my responsibilities as a settler, as a treaty person, together in a good way. Thank you for listening to my story.